thank you so much. It's great to be in San Francisco or really anywhere after the last year and a half that's not my apartment. We have a great panel today. I think the last panel really laid out the challenges we're facing in logistics, in the supply chain. Here we want to talk about really modern, future-facing solutions. So, we have our panel right here. I want to start by way of introduction for each person. We just talk about the role your company plays in transforming transportation for a business, and start with you, Andrew.
Fantastic. Outrider is redefining key linkages in the supply chain through autonomous yard operations. So picture that there's been billions of dollars invested in automating inside warehouse and production facilities. There's now billions of dollars going to over-the-road autonomous vehicles. Outrider, from its founding, has been focused on that critical link between the warehouse door and the over-the-road transportation or rail service or port operations. And this is a critical pain point in the supply chain. Inefficiency in these distribution yards ripples inside the warehouse and into that over-the-road transportation. It is the classic dull, dirty, dangerous job. It is hard to recruit people to do this work. It's also incredibly unsafe to have humans around 80,000-pound vehicles operating 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And it's completely unsustainable. As we're sitting here today, there are 100,000 yard vehicles essentially emitting the equivalent carbon as 2 large coal-fired power plants. So Outrider came together back in 2017 and said, what does that new yard of the future look like? And we are now fully autonomously linking that warehouse door to the over-road transportation and driving efficiency, safety, and sustainability.
All right. Jack, over to you.
Hi, Jack Kennedy, co-founder of Platform Science. What we do is we make it as easy for developers to develop applications for vehicles as it is to develop them for phones. So if you remember a world before your smartphone, your BlackBerry, your flip phone, not much went on. When the smartphone was invented, everything changed. So we wanted to bring that dynamic to the vehicle. And as we're talking about all these complicated problems that we've just now discovered in the last 24 months, it's going to take a lot more than verticalized telematics companies to address everything. So we make it easy for people to develop. We make it easy for fleets to manage those applications. Those people who make those applications are not only developers, but they're often shippers, they're fleets themselves, and a range of folks that you would never think about being in and around the vehicle, including infrastructure providers. We connect it all, make it easy to build an actual linked supply chain by developing things and frameworks that make sense to people that know how to do that. And we do that for some of the largest fleets in the United States, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. And Will, your home team here, so you go ahead last.
So I'm Will O'Donnell, the managing partner of Prologis Ventures. I think at this point people are probably aware what Prologis does. So my role at Prologis, as Hamid alluded to, is I run our ventures group. And it's really about how do we partner with our customers to understand where there's opportunities and how do we drive change. So how do we leverage our platform to understand how we can either invest in the startups that are transforming the industry, like my 2 partners here, or incubate and start businesses ourselves.
Let's go back to you, Will, for a second.
Yeah.
What kind of broader lessons should we be taking from the crisis we're all in right now, especially thinking about not just what's happening now, but how we begin to change that in the future? And everyone else can chime in after.
Yeah, I think, as Hamid said earlier, one of the things that come out of the crisis is the acceleration of change. So consumer expectations are now that it is my God-given right that I can have things delivered same day, next day. If you think of the implications then on supply chain, where 10, 15 years ago, it just needed to be in a store when I showed up to buy it. Now, I want things within hours. So the implications, and this is why transportation is really important for us as a company, we own the nodes, but 50% of the supply chain costs are connecting those nodes together. So if we can understand how to create efficiencies, so how do we get better visibility between the trucks coming to our warehouses, both inbound and outbound, there's huge economic advantages, but there's societal benefits. So the more efficient the trucks come, to Andrew's point earlier, there's a ton of emissions that are being created. So we have an obligation to really think about how we can drive those efficiencies.
Great. Andrew, you want to follow up on that?
Sure. We've seen incredible, I guess one thing we talk about with supply chain challenges, it is truly amazing what has been accomplished in the supply chain. And what's really allowed that to happen is this massive digitization to allow almost 8 billion people on the planet get this rapid delivery cycle. What we see as the next step is clearly automation, that you start taking the digital world and combining it with the physical world. And these automated systems will really provide the resiliency that's needed to address the problems that we've seen recently. But then on top of it, from our company standpoint, We're extremely mission driven, and we see this wave of automation being a total failure for the industry if it's not done sustainably as well. So I always use the analogy, I have absolutely no interest in getting a same-day package delivery in a 120-degree heat dome as we experienced this summer. So bringing these pieces together is really the opportunity for everyone in this field.
Great. Jack?
I think the opportunity is, for the first time, we talk about the supply chain, but we've discussed this internally. The supply chain has been a bit of an ad hoc outcome rather than something that was built by design. So I think the opportunity, which comes with every problem, is there's sort of a global awareness of what it is and what it means when it doesn't work right. And because of that, whether you're talking about sustainability or simply meeting new consumer habits, we're all keenly aware of what that means. So that's a tremendous opportunity to have people focus on the what's next. And the what's next we'll talk about. If I think about supply chains, I think of the internet. We know how a perfectly efficient system works. So if you look at that work backwards, you can kind of get a preview as to how all these systems are going to connect on the way to a better outcome.
Well, let's talk about the future, though. How do you future-proof the supply chain using some of these technologies, automation, sort of monitoring in that way, not just against this crisis, but crises that are going to come? Thinking about how you put the investment in now to ensure you're not caught off guard. We're not caught off guard as much whenever the next bug, take your pick, happens. Over you go.
Two ways. There's two parts to that question. There's sort of a supply side question, and then there's an architectural question. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, now we know that everything matters, right? So shipping without sustainability is not an outcome. That's toothbrushes showing up in a diesel-powered truck and clogging streets up. That doesn't work. But at the same time, building the technologies that are going to, once this problem is understood by all, and we want to deploy technology for all, whether it's the networks, the chips that go into it, all of those things are now essential parts of everyone's lives, whether you can see them or not. So we have to think about how do we have a strategic supply of inputs and an architecture that'll support outputs that we haven't even thought about yet.
Sure.
I think
please.
one of the challenges that exist with supply chain is the atoms versus bytes. Mm-hmm. So with software, it's eminently scalable because I can build as a new software, put on the cloud, and instant outreach to anyone who wants it. If you think about supply chain, there's physical assets. So Pilatus owns 1 billion square feet of warehouses. UPS has over 100,000 trucks. Maersk has thousands of ships. Within the trucking industry, there's 600,000 different trucking companies that each have their individual assets. So in order to create the efficiencies, you need to have technology integrated with these atoms. And that is an infinitely more complex problem than just let's create a scalable software. And it really requires to bring the ecosystem together. So it's one of the things that we're very proud of our ability to leverage our platform, but sit across our customer base and understand where there's common pain points, but also pull the customers together to come up with this ecosystem of solutions. Because if the warehouses are digitized but transportation isn't, it doesn't work. And it really needs to work in concert together.
Yeah, in my reporting, I really try to trace how can we move the amazing advances we've had in software in the tech world more broadly into this really hard world of atoms, whether it's supply chains, whether it's housing and construction. And one thing I wonder about that is, look, there's a great returns you can get in software. It scales really, really fast. That's very attractive. Start with Willie. Are we getting the investment we need in that hard physical atoms stuff that we now suddenly realize we really, really depend on?
We're starting to. And 5 years ago when we started Prologis Ventures, it was really in the forefront of thinking about this is what was going to come. As you started having expectations, the delivery times increased. It also puts pressure throughout the supply chain. I think when people look at a transportation spend in the US, which is $800 billion, it is a massive market to invest into. So you're starting to see a lot more really great companies come out. You're seeing a lot more investors. And corporates like ourselves taking a perspective that we need to invest ahead of what's coming. And I think that's one of the biggest advantages in this industry is you have a lot of forward-looking companies saying, how do I get ahead? How do I put money? There is white space that's here. And how do I bring the right solutions to that? And how do I find the right partners? Yeah. So, yeah, but it's slower. And people are getting there, but it's exciting.
Yeah. Andrew, you want to? I'm curious as a founder and Jack as well in this space.
So I'll make a comment. It is so different today than it was from 5 and 10 years ago. It's a completely different landscape. And one of the big things that has been recognized, and right now we're working with a group of priority customers that represent about 20% of all the yard trucks operating in the US. These customers understand they are no longer trucking companies or packaged goods manufacturers, they are technology companies. And so the boxes in which they ship is as important as their differentiated competitive technology platform they're operating. So not only are we seeing the investment community seeing this opportunity, we're also seeing the customers understand that their investments in innovation and competitive advantage through technology is what defines them over the next decade.
Very, very similar. In the fleet space, if you look at 10 years ago, the newest C-level executive in any fleet is the CIO. That is a new function. It's no longer the IT person with a different name. It's a person whose job it is to change the way they operate, whether it's the ESG stuff, customer satisfaction, or supply chain visibility. So the big fleets, and that's why we concentrate there, they have an insatiable demand to make what they do work better and work across the supply chain. So that's completely new. I think back at the beginning of Will's comments, when we started, we were raising money in, 2016 or so. There was nobody investing in what we do. It was not sexy, it was not interesting, it was software for trucks, it didn't make sense. And ironically, Will was just launching, and my first conversation, they were sitting here during the build out, there was plastic sheets, and there was this guy I never heard of with no website sitting on a plastic table saying, I know exactly what you do and we want to invest in it. And I thought that can't possibly be right. But sure enough, we're sitting here now and it's a relief. I think the big thing for me, it's a huge relief. I thought this is either the worst idea in the world and I don't want anybody to know about it, or it's the best idea. I'm doing a very poor job of explaining it. But today it's a sort of a mainstream thing.
Right. Well, I'm curious. I mean, what do you actually look for when you're investing in companies like this? I mean, you're at your desk with no internet address, and so if you're looking for
He
things.
has a
what do you look?
website
We
now.
did
Here's
have
my website.
internet. Just
Sorry,
to
yeah.
clear, we did have internet. We're
Dial-up.
just renovating this building. No, but I think this is where our position is fairly unique. And I think as a company, innovation's been in our DNA. But Hamid also alluded to the fact we really listen to our customers. So we're able to understand and start connecting the dots on, well, if we keep on hearing the same thing over and over again, that's a real problem. So how do we ask the right questions and really be thesis driven on what's truly the outcome that this industry is looking for? What's the value proposition that we could potentially play in influencing an outcome? And then how do you bring the right parties together? So I think a lot has come down to listening to our customers and being ahead of what's next, but understanding where friction's occurring and actually embracing friction, because that's where true change can happen.
Andrew, autonomy is a really exciting part of what could happen in the future. Tell me how you're seeing companies actually start to incorporate that in their operations and how that's working.
Yeah. So what we realized early on is autonomy in a distribution yard is very different than robo-taxis or over-the-road trucking. And what we realized is it wasn't just automating the vehicle, but all the other manual tasks that take place in the yard, and then integrating those tasks with the data flows of the warehouse management systems and the transportation management system. So we brought together a very unique team to specifically hit on all these key pieces that had to be brought together. So that's the upfront management software, that's the autonomy of the vehicle. All of our vehicles have robotic vision-based machine learning systems to identify the fronts of trailers and connect to them, and then move them with centimeter accuracy around a yard. We're working with customers right now, moving from proving this technology to now operating thousands of trailer moves a day. But it's really through close, you ask about how we work with those customers, it's really through those close interactions that we can find the most modular, scalable applications to scale these systems throughout these distribution networks. And these systems, again, customers now are dispatching them and moving trailers today. But I will say, we do have a solution to the labor crisis. We had our youngest child ever, a 2-year-old, moved a 40,000-pound trailer with 4-centimeter accuracy recent at our facility. So we do have a solution to a lot of problems now.
That's amazing right there. Yeah.
I won't make any OSHA jokes.
Yeah. And I have a 4-year-old, and I don't think he could pull that off.
Send him over.
Yeah. Jack, I want to ask you something. This is something that came up in our prep call, which really grabbed me. You talked about the problem of 3G sunsetting, which sounds like a resort actually, but what does it actually mean as a real actual pain point going forward for some of this?
Sure. I think it's we all remember, what was supposed to happen in the Y2K world, right? And nothing really happened. But this time around, it's a little different because we weren't so connected back then. right? And things we take for granted, the more you take it for granted, the more likely it's connected to a 3G radio, right? So a trailer, any kind of access or control or alarms. So I brought that up on the call because I thought this is an interesting time when people always debate the role of government and when it can be useful or not. The introduction of 5G, driven by government, they're playing a role in making things faster, but at the expense of 3G before we're ready for it, because there's not enough chips or enough radios out there. That's a debate. So suddenly the government finds themselves in a very unusual spot because they're not sure, are they going to move faster by moving faster or move faster by moving slower in the case of delaying the 3G rollout. So nobody really knows. It's not something that's well tracked. Even very large sophisticated companies aren't sure what their infrastructure looks like across the board. So I think we're going to find out.
So the issue is
yeah, go ahead.
get shut off.
Yeah,
well,
Yeah,
So
because
you have
what's the
abandoned
worst
vehicles.
case sort of possibility here?
the worst case, well, I'll just give you one. Just recently, Sprint announced they've moved their date back. All the networks do not have the same date. So most people don't even know when their radio is going to get shut off. So it was originally going to be, I believe, the end of this year for Sprint, and then AT&T mid-February, and then Verizon at the end of 22. So they're not synced. So it's something that people aren't really thinking about. So as we think about a connected supply chain, as we think about what that critical infrastructure will be, obviously knowing what you're on is going to be a key part of that. So I think as we go forward, there'll be a little bit of a different view of that sort of thing.
Talking about a little bit about the government, I mean, what does everyone hope or sees coming out of the ongoing, evolving, mutating infrastructure bill we have in Congress? I mean, maybe Will, if you want to start, and I'd love to hear everyone else's input.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're most excited about is the electrification of fleets. So looking across our customer base, a significant number of them are investing really heavily into the electrification. However, that infrastructure does not exist today. So it's a really interesting opportunity on how do you get ahead of what we know is coming, where do you put that infrastructure in, and how do you do it in a seamless manner that it makes it easy for our customers to operate. There's a huge societal benefits related to it, and then it's a gigantic white space from a business opportunity because you're suddenly going to have to provide fuel, and instead of traditional fuel, it's going to be electrons to run these fleets. So for us, the transportation bill is an area that is addressing that. I think where we have a unique opportunity is rather than 8,000 and 5,000 individual customers trying to aggregate and decide how to convey that information, we can help be a conduit. And both with the government on here's how policies be structured, but also from the utilities themselves. So in Southern California, rather than having SoCal Edison individually try to work with 800 different customers, we can help streamline those conversations and help really drive solutions ahead of when they're needed.
Jack?
Yeah, I think in this playing off that your previous question, in my view, the best role for that bill and government in general is when can you deliver critical mass to something that needs critical mass or it's never going to happen, right? So whether it is 5G or electrification, there are these things we all know is a good idea, but unless you're a very rare individual that can create that by yourself, sometimes it needs a push. So I think broadly speaking, electrification, yes, 5G infrastructure. It's just a question of balancing the when and the how.
Andrew?
And I'll go on top of the fact there's a huge opportunity to direct the supply chain towards this more sustainable platform, so that's great. From my standpoint, when you have all this private sector innovation, and the one thing that I always hope with any of these large bills is that we don't basically fund the old way of doing things, but we think about essentially creating that platform, that playing field, raising the playing field to continue to drive the innovation on top of it. So we're very focused on making sure that we have the best systems and just educating the world about how advanced the technology is today so that we aren't funding more diesel stations along big highways.
Well, that sort of brings me up. I mean, we talk about wanting to get back to normal out of this current crisis, but is that actually where we want to get to?
No.
Or we want to get somewhere else? Yeah, go ahead.
No, as I mentioned earlier, there really was no supply
Right.
chain. Right? Nobody thought it out and said, this is the way it works. And I mentioned the internet because that's a very structured, highly efficient thing with atoms. Not atoms, neutrons, not atoms. So now is the opportunity to think about that, right? If we're not going to talk people out of same-day delivery or one-hour delivery or any of these things that they learned during a very difficult time. So if that's the status quo for a period of time. How do we want to build around that? And that needs a lot of thought. Electrification, top of the list, right? Connectivity to make those things work autonomously, right there with it, right? So now's the time to think about what it should be, not what it was.
Yeah. And security of those systems and making sure they're redundant. I mean, that's the other thing about these incredibly interconnected systems. And we think about this every day is it's all great until it's not great. And so it's all about redundancy and safety and building in the platforms needed underneath the system as well.
Absolutely.
And I think with all things in life, there's an evolution. So there are things that are better coming out of this crisis, and there's expectations we have. There's also an opportunity to reset and say, how can we fix and improve? So to your point originally, no, we don't ever want to get back to what normal used to be, but how do we make it better tomorrow?
Turn to Tracy, who has some questions to the audience.
I've got a really salient one just based on the conversation that you are all having. Which hits scale first, AV cars or AV trucks, and why? And where will all of the EV trucks charge? At loading docks or during the unloading process or elsewhere, off or on site?
Great.
You want to start with
I
that?
might have an opinion on
Yeah,
that.
I think so.
So these yard environments in which we're focused are really the perfect application for autonomy. It's repetitive tasks, dull, dirty, dangerous jobs that are hard to find people for. And from an electrification standpoint, it's a complete no-brainer. I mean, these yard trucks should have been electric 20 years ago. These vehicles don't have range anxiety. They're working in a confined private property environment where they can be charged easily. In terms of over-the-road transportation, there's a lot of work, and because you're just going, there's a lot of work in the automation, and because you've got the ability to go point to point, there's huge opportunity in limiting the problem set, and you still just have the safety issue of being at 60 miles an hour as a robot as opposed to 5 or 10 or 15 within a yard. And then in terms of electrification and alternative fuel sources for the longer haul trucking, some of the most interesting things just has to do with using different swap techniques essentially. So if you need to go from point A to point B and it's longer than the range of a system, you just have very efficient, fully autonomous transfer hubs along the way to get goods across a longer distance.
I think your question was AV cars versus trucks, so part of your question there. I think taking it a step further, I look at use cases, and I think there's the convergence of different critical mass drivers. So I think of the ports in LA, and I think of the Inland Empire, right, where you guys live. No-brainer for either EV or autonomous EV vehicles going from port to distribution center in the middle of the night on the HOV lanes. Period, right? So it'll start with these campus-like opportunities, whether they're confined with a fence or confined with guardrails, to places where there's already massive inefficiencies unrelated to transportation. That's a traffic problem. That's a smog problem. So that solves about 3 different problems. So I think there's enough big problems with multiple winners that will drive the outcomes rather than how cool or interesting it is. I don't have a strong opinion about AV cars. I don't like them. I don't like being in them. I don't like being in the passenger seat when somebody goes, look, we're changing lanes. I'm not there yet.
I do that to my wife and children all the time these days.
Not
It's the best life of pilot.
I know too much.
I think on that, Jack touched on it. Autonomy happens when it's repeatable processes that you can combine in a step. So I think when people talk about AV vehicles, you have to break it down into components that are actually solvable versus how do I come up with the 1 billion plus possibly use cases or scenarios that happen. So I think if you start with a repeatable process that I can remove constraints around or remove variables around, yards is a great example, that's where it's going to occur first. I think if you also think the same way with EV infrastructure, where is the repeatable process that's going over and over? That will help you drive to understand where it's going to occur first, which would be, for example, local delivery, where you have a warehouse that has fleets going out, running relatively same routes every day and coming back. That's an easier problem to solve than, okay, how do I build out the network where I have millions of trucks going in a variety of different directions and have them be able to touch up and fill up on EV on the way. That will occur, but you've got to get density of vehicles, you've got to figure out the networks in order to get the higher utilization. So I think you break the problem set into ways that you can simplify it, what's repeatable, where can you get utilization, and then frankly, which vehicles are going to come first. And you're going to see Sprinter vans and so on come before long-haul vehicles.
Great.
Beautiful.
Back to you to close it out, Brian.
Great. Well, I had a question for you, actually. I mean, what happens at the corporate, what needs to happen at the corporate level to really break open this kind of innovation around infrastructure, around transportation and shipping?
I think one of the most powerful advantages corporates have, especially in something like supply chain and logistics, is the fact that we do own the atoms. And innovation occurs when constraints are removed and suddenly white space opens. And by that, Uber, for example, became Uber because they could suddenly use AI to match thousands of vehicles. And they removed the constraint of, I'm willing to get into a vehicle. Now, in supply chain, we can look at it and say, what new white space is opening up next to our platform that we can invest into? EV infrastructure is one that we've been talking about. I think you need to get corporates to be able to look beyond what our core business is, listen to customers and say there's a pain point, and really be innovative and willing to test. And more companies are getting the abilities to do that. It's not easy because you've been successful doing it the right way, but if you really ask yourself the question of why and how, you can drive change.
Andrew, you mentioned something earlier about sustainability going beyond just energy and climate, but actually health, I think. You talked about like how difficult it is to do the shipping in 110-degree weather and heat domes. I mean, whether it's your technology or others, how can we begin to address that in the future, knowing this is, it's going to get worse? I mean, in the Olympic Day event, the UN fixes climate change next week. We'll know it will.
Yeah. So we did a recent survey, and it was actually amazing to see a majority of supply chain workers thinking about sustainability and being. And there was a comment in the earlier panel about, pay is one thing, but people choosing where to work. So across the board, these large logistics-dependent enterprise customers we're working with, and again, this transformation's really happened in the last 5-10 years, but people want to work for a company that's passionate about doing good things for the world. So we see all of these companies think about their carbon footprint, not want to have idling diesel trucks next to warehouse workers or those, or any of the drivers coming out of the yard. So it's kind of given me a lot of energy to continue with this mission, because the world's actually heading in a really great direction when it comes to sustainability right now.
Excellent. Are there any thoughts on sustainability more generally for either of you as well?
I think it's once you connect everything digitally, and once you open those systems up where people can creatively develop, first of all, you're going to see creative solutions, entrepreneurial response to it. And then you're going to see some regulatory requirements, and then you're going to see the third order effects when the shipper, the receiver, and even the customer is going to start making choices based on what they think the footprint of that particular event has to do with what they just did. So that's all technologically possible now. So I think the transparency of that's going to really change things at an accelerated rate.
Okay.
As I say, I think that's one of the more exciting opportunities. If you think of supply chain as the simplistic way is a wagon wheel, where it's used to start and emanate out, but really how it's evolved, it's almost a spider web, where you have all these nodes that are consistently and constantly reconnecting. And you gotta, with the technology, figure out how do you get better connectivity and visibility across all these disparate parties. And we're now starting to have the technology that can form the basis, and that goes back when suddenly constraints are being lifted, where you can have a connected vehicle that has an operating system that you can build apps onto. And with that, what does that open up for us as an industry and ecosystem to really drive change? And out of it are going to be sustainable benefits. There's going to be economic benefits. There's quality of life benefits. And a lot of this technology is really about enhancing the productivity and experience and the safety of the workers doing it. So the safer the vehicle it is, the better the experience of that driver, both at the job and even at home, that they can spend more time with their families, et cetera.
I want to sort of, as we close out here, I would love everyone to say, I know we're not going back to normal, but I do want to know, when are we going to get back to this no longer being a thing that's on everyone's mind, that like even just people in the general news are like supply chain, bottlenecks, things like that. So just like, what's your sort of guess, each of you, for when this will begin to loosen up in a way, and then we'll check back, after that time and figure out who won.
Excellent.
Start with that, Will.
So the optimistic is probably February, March of next year. I think with supply chain, there's ripple effects, as we clearly have seen, where one thing goes wrong, it impacts over here. I think there's not gonna be one lever you pull. I think it's gonna gradually improve, and then at one point, we'll look around and be like, okay, things are going faster and faster. So I think Christmas is going to be tough for a variety of reasons. you'll start to see improvements coming out at the beginning of the year, and it'll get better and better, and people are going to figure out how to fix this. And the new normal will be more resilient, more thoughtful, and actually be more robust to prevent this from happening again.
Okay. Jack?
Yeah, I think difficult to say, obviously, but I think a lot of what's happening now is people are finding alternative ways of satisfying whatever their needs are, right? So exactly back to normal is impossible or not even desirable, right? So I think I'm more concerned, not too concerned, but there will be a glut, like we're forgetting that part. Every scarcity period is followed by a glut, which is going to screw us up again in another way. And then it'll start to, again, we're going into a very, very different place when this is all over. And I can't predict when that's going to be obvious, but we're definitely on our way.
Okay.
I have two responses to the question. The first thing is that I see as we get into the first half of next year, us having kind of the almost overcorrection because of people now overbuying in prep or to deal with the current crisis, people are overbuying, and then we're going to have a period where production is going to drop because there'll be less demand. So I think we'll sort of see this turbulent bouncing out and then come to this more resilient, more automated, connected system. And the second comment I was going to say is I think this Christmas is going to be great. Because if there was one thing that we learned during the pandemic, it's that having a little bit more time to be disconnected and with family is fantastic. And having a 6, 8, and 10-year-old having a little less stuff at Christmas, a little more time with family will be fantastic.
Yeah, the gifts are going to be about experiences.
Right.
And spending, like, let's cook dinner together versus a new doll.
When Christmas rolls around, I go to my 4-year-old and I tell him, like, sorry, I don't have any gifts, but I'm going to tell him what Andrew said.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
And I'll call
We
you
can
up
play
and you
some
can
games,
explain it
exactly.
in more detail. But this has been a great panel. Thank you to Andrew, to Jack, and to Will, and to Prologis, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah, Brian,
You,
thank
Tracy.
you.